The cold came in through the window frame, a thin, sharp knife of air that sliced through the worn wool of the blanket. Leo, all of 7 years old, pulled it tighter around his chin, the rough fibers scratching his skin. He didn't mind. The scratch was better than the shiver. From his spot on the floor, tucked into a nest of pillows and coats, he could see the sliver of gray morning light under the front door. It was a weak light, the kind that promised more snow, not warmth. The only sound in the small apartment was the rasp of his father's breathing from the other room, and the angry rattle of the window pane as the wind pushed against it. It was a lonely sound, the sound of a house that was giving up. On the door, stuck there with a piece of aggressive, peeling tape, was the paper. It had appeared yesterday, a yellow paper with thick black letters. Leo couldn't read all the words, but he knew the big ones. Eviction notice. Final warning. He knew what they meant because he had seen the look on his father's face when he'd read it. It was the same look he'd had a year ago when the doctors told him his leg would never be the same. A hollowed-out look, like someone had reached inside and scooped out all the hope. His father, Frank, was a good man. Leo knew this the way he knew the sun was hot and ice was cold. Before, his dad had been big and loud, with a laugh that could shake the dust from the ceiling. He'd toss Leo into the air and catch him, his hands sure and strong, but that was before the sand and the noise and the long, quiet flight home. Now his father was mostly quiet. The pain in his leg made him quiet. The metal rods and screws under his skin made him slow. Sometimes, at night, Leo would hear him groan, a low, wounded sound that made Leo's own chest feel tight and small. This morning the quiet was different. It was heavier. Leo pushed himself out of his nest, his bare feet recoiling from the icy floorboards. He crept to his father's doorway. Frank was sitting on the edge of his bed, his bad leg propped on a stool. He was wearing his old army fatigues, the only pants that fit comfortably over the brace. He wasn't looking at anything, just staring at the wall, his shoulders slumped. The yellow paper was on the nightstand next to him, a poisonous flower blooming in the gloom. Leo knew his father was trying to be strong for him, but he could see the cracks. He could see the fear. They had nowhere else to go. The world outside was a frozen, unforgiving place, and this small, cold apartment was the only shell they had left. Leo backed away from the door, his heart a frantic little bird trapped in his ribs. He felt a familiar, useless anger at the world, at the broken leg, at the man who had taped that yellow paper to their door. A small, silent promise formed in his mind. He would do something. He didn't know what. But he would not let his father look that hollowed out again. He was just a little boy, unseen by a world that didn't have time for broken soldiers or their quiet sons. But even the smallest stone, if thrown just right, could make a very big ripple. Frank's story was written in the scars on his leg and the silence that had settled over their lives. He had served 2 tours a lifetime ago. He'd been a mechanic, his hands calloused and capable, able to coax life back into the most stubborn engines. He'd loved the roar of a well-tuned machine, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. The explosion that had torn through his Humvee had stolen more than just the integrity of his tibia. It had stolen the man he used to be. The recovery was a brutal landscape of surgeries, infections, and physical therapy that felt more like punishment than healing. By the time he was medically discharged, the world he returned to felt alien. His wife, Leo's mother, had fought her own war with an illness that had no clear enemy and no honorable discharge. She was gone 6 months after he came home, leaving a void that felt as vast and empty as the desert he'd just left. They had moved to this small town, this forgotten corner of the state, for the promise of cheap rent and a quiet life. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a crumbling brick building owned by a man named Arthur Albright. Albright had a portfolio of such buildings, all of them breathing their last, housing people with few other options. He had seemed pleasant enough at first, with a polished smile and a firm handshake, overlooking Frank's spotty employment history and accepting his disability checks as proof of income. The promises he made about fixing the leaky faucet and the drafty windows were as smooth and empty as his smile. For Leo, the apartment was a map of their struggles. The permanent water stain on the ceiling above his bed looked like a sad, gray continent. The crack in the kitchen linoleum was a river he had to jump over every morning. He had learned to be self-reliant in ways no 7-year-old should. He knew how to make toast in the finicky toaster oven without burning it. He knew which floorboards to avoid so they wouldn't groan and wake his father when the pain was bad. He was the keeper of their small world, the silent observer. His sketchbook was his only confidant. He drew everything. He drew his father, sometimes with a superhero cape flowing behind his wheelchair, sometimes as a giant sleeping bear. He drew the sad continent on the ceiling, and lately he had started drawing Mr. Albright. In his drawings, Albright was never smiling. He was a man made of sharp angles and long shadows, with a keyhole for a heart. One drawing from a month ago showed Mr. Albright standing over their broken radiator, which had died in the first deep freeze of November. Frank had called, left messages. Albright had eventually shown up, not with a plumber, but with a clipboard. He'd tapped the frigid metal with a polished shoe. "It's an old building, Frank," he'd said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "These things happen. The lease says cosmetic and minor repairs are your responsibility." Frank had argued, his voice tired. "This isn't cosmetic, Arthur. My son is sleeping in his winter coat." Albright had just shrugged, the gesture a masterclass in indifference. "The law is the law. You're 2 months behind anyway. I'd be careful about making waves." Leo, watching from the hallway, had memorized the coldness in the man's eyes. He drew it later, a tiny shard of ice in the center of a dark circle. That was the day he understood that some monsters didn't have claws or fangs. Some wore nice suits and carried clipboards. The yellow eviction notice was not a surprise. It was the logical conclusion to a story that had been written in neglect and greed from the very beginning. Miles away, the low rumble of engines was a constant, steady heartbeat. The Sentinels Motorcycle Club was not what most people imagined. Their clubhouse was an old, converted fire station, meticulously clean. The chrome on their bikes gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the garage. Their cuts, the leather vests bearing their club patch, a stylized eagle with a gear in its talons, were earned through loyalty and service, not violence. They were mechanics, carpenters, electricians, and a surprising number of veterans. They were men who had seen the chaos of the world and had chosen to build their own order within it. Their president, a man they called Forge, was pouring coffee behind a long, worn bar. His real name was Marcus Thorne, but no one had used it in years. Forge fit him better. He was a man who could take broken things and make them strong again, whether it was a busted transmission or a fractured spirit. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, his face a roadmap of hard-won lessons. A deep scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a life he'd left behind long ago. He'd founded the Sentinels on a simple code, forged in the crucible of his own painful past. We protect our own, and we defend those the world has forgotten. It was a code born from a time when he himself had been forgotten, a kid tossed aside by a system that had no use for him. A kind stranger, a grizzled old mechanic, had seen something in him, had given him a wrench and a purpose. Forge had never forgotten that. He spent his life paying that debt forward. Across the room, a man known as Doc was hunched over a laptop, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. Before he'd traded his suit for leather, he'd been a paralegal, a man who knew the labyrinthine ways of the law. He'd grown tired of watching the wealthy use the law as a weapon against the poor. Now his expertise served the club and their community. He helped members with paperwork, navigated Veterans Affairs bureaucracy, and deciphered the fine print on predatory contracts. Beside him, a quiet giant named Shepard was methodically cleaning a carburetor, his movements precise and economical. Shepard had been a combat medic. He'd seen the worst of humanity, and it had left him with a fierce, almost holy need to create peace wherever he could. These were the Sentinels. They were not angels of hell, but guardians at the gate. They held charity drives, escorted military funerals, and had a reputation in the surrounding towns as the last people you ever wanted to cross, but the first people you called when you were in real trouble. They operated on a currency of respect and action, not money or fear. They were a brotherhood, a chosen family bound by a shared understanding that true strength wasn't about intimidation. It was about who you were willing to stand for. They were riding through their day, unaware that a 7-year-old boy with a sketchbook and a silent promise was about to intersect their path and remind them exactly what their code was for. The trigger was a small, cruel act of humiliation. Albright arrived 2 days after posting the notice, not to negotiate, but to escalate. He brought a handyman with him, a nervous man who wouldn't make eye contact. They weren't there to fix the heat. They were there to change the locks. Frank met them at the door, leaning heavily on his cane. "Arthur, you can't do this. The notice period isn't even up. It's illegal." Albright smiled, that polished, empty smile. "Consider it a preemptive measure, Frank. A precaution. You're a liability. I'll have the key here at the management office. You can retrieve your things once you're fully paid up." His eyes flickered past Frank, into the dim apartment, a look of pure disdain on his face. "Frankly, I'll be doing the building a favor." The words struck Frank harder than a physical blow. He sagged against the doorframe, the fight draining out of him. He was a soldier, he was a father, and here, in his own home, he was being rendered powerless, stripped of his dignity in front of his son. Leo was watching from his bedroom doorway, small and still as a statue. He saw the handyman start to drill into the old lock, the high-pitched whine of the tool like a scream. He saw his father's shoulders slump in defeat. In that moment, something inside Leo broke. The fear and sadness curdled into a cold, hard resolve. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He acted, while Albright was distracted, lecturing Frank on the minutiae of the lease agreement. Leo slipped out the back door, down the rickety fire escape that shuddered under his small weight. He hit the frozen ground running, his thin sneakers slapping against the icy pavement. He didn't have a plan, just a direction. He ran toward the gas station on the corner, the place where he sometimes saw the big, loud motorcycles lined up like sleeping metal beasts. He didn't know who the men were, but they looked strong. They looked like the opposite of Mr. Albright. He saw them as he rounded the corner, a half-dozen bikes parked by the air pump. The men were standing around, drinking coffee from paper cups. They were big men, dressed in black leather that seemed to soak up the weak winter light. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, but he didn't stop. He ran right up to the biggest one, the man with the graying beard and the calm, steady eyes. It was Forge. Leo was too out of breath, too overwhelmed to speak. The words were stuck in his throat. So he did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his sketchbook. He fumbled through the pages, past the drawings of superheroes and sleeping bears, until he found the one he'd drawn last night. It was a picture of their apartment building. A huge, angry red X was drawn over their window. His father was inside, looking small and sad, and outside, a tall, skinny figure with a keyhole for a heart, Mr. Albright, was holding a giant key, smiling a jagged, sharp-toothed smile. Leo held the sketchbook up to Forge, his small hand trembling. He didn't have to say a word. The drawing said everything. Forge looked from the desperate drawing to the boy's terrified face, and in that instant, he understood. The world had forgotten someone again. Forge knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The scent of leather and gasoline surrounded Leo, but it wasn't scary, it was solid. "What's your name, son?" Forge's voice was a low rumble, like a distant engine. "Leo," the boy whispered. "And who's this?" Forge asked, tapping the figure of the sad man in the window. "My dad." Forge looked at the other men, Shepard, Doc, and 3 others. No words were exchanged. None were needed. A silent understanding passed between them, a current of shared purpose. Forge stood up and placed a heavy, gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. "Okay, Leo, show us the way." As Leo led them back down the street, the sound of their heavy boots on the pavement was a new kind of heartbeat, a steady, powerful rhythm that promised a reckoning was coming. When they arrived, Albright was just finishing his lecture, the handyman packing up his drill. The sight of 6 large men in leather vests appearing at the end of the hallway brought his monologue to a halt. They moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. They didn't block the exit, but their presence filled the narrow corridor, changing the very air. Forge stood at the front with Leo half hidden behind his leg, one small hand clutching the worn denim of his jeans. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Albright asked, his voice a little too high. He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture. Forge ignored him. He looked at Frank, who was staring at the group in stunned confusion. "Are you Frank?" he asked, his voice calm and respectful. Frank nodded, bewildered. "Yes. Who are you?" "We're friends of your son," Forge said simply. His eyes then settled on Albright, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "And you are?" "I'm Arthur Albright. I'm the owner of this building. This is a private matter." "Doesn't look private," Forge said, his gaze flicking to the freshly drilled hole in the door where the lock used to be. "Looks like you're trying to throw a man and his boy out into the cold." Albright puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority. "This tenant is in arrears. I am acting within my legal rights." Doc stepped forward, his reading glasses still perched on his nose. He looked more like a professor than a biker. "Which specific statute are you citing for a preemptive lock change prior to the end of the legal eviction notice period in a dwelling that, by the looks of it, is not temperature compliant with State Housing Code 34B? Albright blinked. He was prepared for anger, for threats. He was not prepared for legal citations from a man wearing a skull ring. That's not. The unit's heating is a separate issue." "Is it?" Doc continued, his tone mild. "Because failure to provide essential utilities like heat can be considered a constructive eviction, which is illegal. And changing the locks without a court order? That's also highly illegal. You're not acting within your rights, Mr. Albright. You're breaking the law." The power in the hallway had shifted completely. Albright's polished confidence began to flake away, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. He looked from Doc's intelligent eyes to Shepard's imposing silent frame, to Forge's unwavering stare. He was a bully, and his tactics were useless against men who could not be bullied. "My dad said the heat's been broken for a month." Leo's small voice piped up from behind Forge's leg. Mr. Albright said it wasn't his problem. Forge's eyes narrowed. He took a slow step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "When a child is cold, it is everyone's problem," he said, the words landing with the weight of absolute conviction. "You're going to have that old lock put back on this door. Then you're going to call a plumber and get the heat fixed. Today. And then you're going to go back to your office and we are going to have a conversation about Frank's lease. Am I clear?" Albright swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at the faces of the men before him. There was no anger in their expressions, no malice. There was something far more terrifying: certainty. He gave a jerky nod to the handyman, who quickly began the process of uninstalling the new lock. Albright had lost. He knew it. But he had no idea that this was only the beginning. He had just picked a fight with an army he couldn't see, mobilized by the courage of a 7-year-old boy. The initial confrontation was just the opening move. Forge knew that intimidating Albright was a temporary fix. A man like that would just wait until they were gone and then come back with lawyers and marshals. The Sentinels didn't just solve problems, they dismantled them. While Shepard stayed with Frank and Leo, a silent, reassuring mountain of a man who somehow got the terrified handyman to not only restore the old lock but also take a look at the rattling window frame, Forge and Doc returned to their clubhouse. It was time to go to war, and Doc was their quartermaster. Doc's corner of the clubhouse transformed into a command center. He pulled up county property records, housing court filings, and online tenant review boards. A pattern quickly emerged. Arthur Albright owned 12 buildings across 3 counties, all in low-income neighborhoods, and all with a long history of complaints. There were dozens of stories just like Frank's: illegal lockouts, security deposits that vanished, and threats of eviction for requesting basic repairs. Albright was a predator, systematically bleeding the most vulnerable people in the community. "He's a slumlord, plain and simple," Doc said, pointing to a screen full of data. "He buys the buildings cheap, never invests a penny in them, and uses the threat of homelessness to keep his tenants quiet. He knows they don't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back." Forge nodded grimly. "So we give them the resources." Their first step was to find allies. The next morning, Forge and Doc, dressed in clean jeans and plain jackets, their cuts left behind to avoid intimidation, paid a visit to the local legal aid society. They presented their findings calmly and professionally. The lawyer on duty was skeptical at first, but Doc's meticulously organized file, complete with annotated housing codes and a list of potential fellow plaintiffs, quickly won her over. She agreed to take on Frank's case pro bono and to begin outreach to Albright's other tenants. Meanwhile, another crucial piece fell into place. At school, Leo's teacher, a young, perceptive woman named Anya Sharma, had noticed the change in him. The quiet boy had become almost invisible, and his drawings, which were usually full of imaginative heroes, had become dark and fearful. That morning he drew a picture of a little bear shivering in a cave, while a tall, thin fox stood outside, holding a key. Ms. Sharma knelt by his desk. "Leo, can you tell me about your drawing?" Leo, feeling safe in the warm classroom and emboldened by his encounter with the Sentinels, finally spoke. "It's our house," he whispered, pointing to the cave. "It's cold. The fox wants to kick us out." Ms. Sharma's heart ached. Following school protocol, she made a call to Child Protective Services, which in turn triggered a wellness check. That afternoon, a detective named Miller, a weary but decent man just a few years from retirement, was dispatched to Frank and Leo's apartment. He arrived expecting a routine, messy domestic situation. Instead, he found Frank, a quiet veteran, and a 7-foot-tall biker named Shepard, patiently helping Leo with his homework at the kitchen table. The apartment was still cold, but it was clean and orderly. Miller was taken aback. He'd dealt with motorcycle clubs before, and this wasn't it. Shepard was polite, respectful, and deferred all questions to Frank. Frank, with Shepard's quiet encouragement, told Miller everything: the broken heat, the illegal lockout attempt, the constant harassment from Albright. Miller listened, his cop's intuition telling him this was the truth. He took pictures of the dead radiator and the drafty window frames. He documented everything. "I can't promise anything," Miller said as he was leaving, "but neglecting a child's basic need for a warm home is a serious offense. I'll be opening an official investigation into Mr. Albright's property management practices." He gave a nod to Shepard. "You guys keeping an eye on things?" "Yes, sir," Shepard said. "We are." The gears of justice, rusted from disuse, were beginning to grind into motion. Albright, believing he had merely been hassled by some local thugs, had no idea that a multi-pronged attack was being mounted against him. The law, the school system, and the police were all converging on his shady empire, all activated by one child's drawing and the brotherhood that had chosen to see it. The ripples from Leo's small act of courage were spreading, preparing to become a tidal wave. News travels fast in a small town, and the story of the bikers defending a veteran began to circulate. It was whispered about in diners, at the grocery store, and over backyard fences. Arthur Albright, feeling the pressure, decided to go on the offensive. He filed for a restraining order against the Sentinels, claiming he was being harassed and intimidated. He painted himself as the victim, a small businessman being targeted by a dangerous gang. It was a classic bully's move: play the victim when confronted. It was also a colossal mistake. The court hearing for the restraining order was the first public stage for the conflict. Albright arrived in a crisp suit, flanked by his lawyer. He expected a handful of rough-looking bikers to show up and prove his point. Instead, Forge, Doc, and Shepard arrived, accompanied by the lawyer from the Legal Aid Society. They were joined by Frank, standing tall despite his cane, and a dozen other tenants from Albright's various buildings, all of whom had been contacted by the Legal Aid Outreach team. They filled the back of the courtroom, a silent, diverse coalition of the ignored. Albright's case fell apart under the calm, methodical questioning from the legal aid lawyer. When Detective Miller was called as a witness and presented his report on the state of Frank's apartment, complete with photographs and a timeline of neglected repair requests, the judge's expression soured. The restraining order was summarily dismissed. The local newspaper, present for what they thought would be a colorful story about a biker gang, suddenly had a much bigger story. Local landlord accused of widespread neglect and tenant intimidation. The article was a spark on dry tinder. The story exploded. Suddenly, everyone knew Frank's name. Donations started pouring into a fund set up by the Legal Aid Society. A local heating and cooling company offered to replace Frank and Leo's entire system for free. The community, once silent, began to choose a side. But the Sentinels knew that public opinion was fickle. They needed to make a statement that no one could ignore, a symbol of their unwavering commitment. The following Saturday, Albright woke to a sound he couldn't place. It was a low, deep rumble, like a distant earthquake. He went to his front window, which overlooked the manicured lawn of his pristine home in a wealthy, secluded suburb. His jaw dropped. Parked on the street, lining both sides for as far as he could see, were motorcycles, not a dozen, but hundreds. Sentinels chapters from 3 states had ridden in overnight. A silent, disciplined army answering the call. They weren't on his lawn, not yet. They were on public property, perfectly legal. 200 bikes, their chrome glinting in the morning sun, their riders standing beside them, silent and still. They weren't shouting or protesting, they were simply there. A silent, leather-clad vigil. Their message was clear and uncompromising. We are here. We are watching. You will not be allowed to forget. The police arrived, but there was nothing they could do. The bikers were peaceful, sober, and not breaking any laws. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, their comfortable suburban quiet shattered by this display of raw, controlled power. News vans pulled up, cameras rolling. The image was unforgettable. The sprawling mansion of the accused slumlord, besieged by a silent army of guardians. Albright's phone began to ring incessantly, with calls from the media, from city officials, from his wealthy friends demanding to know what he had done to bring this upon their peaceful neighborhood. He had tried to isolate and intimidate one vulnerable man. In response, a brotherhood had brought the fight to his front door and put his injustice on display for the entire world to see. The public reckoning had begun. The silent vigil on Albright's street was the tipping point. The visual was too powerful to ignore. The story was no longer a local dispute. It went regional, then national. It became a symbol of a broken system where a disabled veteran could be left in the cold while a predator profited. The pressure on the district attorney's office became immense. With the evidence gathered by Detective Miller, the testimony of dozens of tenants organized by legal aid, and the forensic accounting Doc had done on Albright's business practices, a criminal case was finally opened. Albright was charged with multiple counts of tenant fraud, reckless endangerment, and illegal eviction practices. The trial was a methodical dismantling of Albright's carefully constructed facade of respectability. One by one, former tenants took the stand. They were elderly people, single mothers, recent immigrants, the exact people Albright had preyed upon, believing their voices didn't matter. They spoke of broken plumbing, rodent infestations, and the constant fear of being thrown out for complaining. Their individual stories, once whispered in isolation, now formed a deafening chorus of neglect and abuse. Frank's testimony was the emotional core of the trial. He didn't speak with anger, but with a quiet, wounded dignity. He described the cold, the feeling of failure as a father, the humiliation of being powerless. When the prosecutor asked him why he didn't leave sooner, he looked at the jury and said, "Every penny I have goes to keeping my son fed and clothed." A man like Mr. Albright, he knows that. He counts on it. He knows that for people like us, there is no sooner, there is no somewhere else. The most powerful moment, however, came from Leo. He didn't testify in the open courtroom. He spoke to the judge and the lawyers in chambers, with Ms. Sharma by his side. The prosecutor showed the judge the sketchbook. Page after page, the drawings told the story. The sad continent on the ceiling, the broken radiator drawn like a frozen sleeping animal, and the final drawing of the fox with the keyhole heart. When the judge asked Leo why he drew that, Leo's answer was simple. "Because he locked up all the good stuff," he said. "The warmth, the safe feeling, he kept it all for himself." The verdict was swift and decisive. Guilty on all counts. As the judgment was read, Albright's face, for the first time, lost its polished sheen. It crumbled into a mask of disbelief and rage. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, ordered to pay restitution to every tenant he had defrauded, and his property management license was permanently revoked. His buildings were to be placed in a receivership managed by a non-profit housing authority. In the back of the courtroom, Forge stood with his arms crossed, watching. He felt no joy, no triumph. He only felt a quiet sense of rightness, of a balance being restored. As Frank and Leo left the courthouse, surrounded by a small crowd of cheering supporters, Forge caught Leo's eye. He gave the boy a slow, single nod. It was a gesture that said everything. You were heard. You were believed. You were brave. Justice had not been given. It had been demanded, fought for by a brotherhood, and won by the undeniable truth in a child's drawing. The conviction of Arthur Albright was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a transformation. The public outcry and media attention had exposed a deep rot in the city's housing system, and now people were demanding change. The city council, under immense pressure, convened a special task force on tenant rights. Doc, representing the Sentinels, was invited to participate, alongside the lawyers from legal aid and other community advocates. Over several months, they drafted and passed a new set of local ordinances. It was unofficially nicknamed Leo's Law. The legislation established a tenants' bill of rights, drastically increased the penalties for slumlords, and created a well-funded city office to proactively inspect rental properties and mediate disputes. It mandated that landlords could not begin eviction proceedings during the winter months against vulnerable tenants, including veterans, the elderly, and families with young children. A dedicated legal fund was also established, seeded with the restitution money seized from Albright's assets, to provide free representation for low-income tenants. The impact was immediate and tangible. In the first year, evictions dropped by 40%. Hundreds of families received help they never knew existed. The nonprofit that took over Albright's buildings began a massive renovation project, hiring local contractors and even some of the tenants themselves. Frank's apartment was one of the first to be overhauled. New windows were installed, the walls were insulated and painted, and a powerful, efficient new furnace was installed. The community that had rallied around him didn't disappear after the trial. Volunteers from local unions and church groups came on weekends to help with repairs, bringing food and offering friendship. The Sentinels became an established, if unconventional, part of the community's safety net. Their clubhouse phone number was now passed around by social workers and aid organizations as a last resort for people who had fallen through every other crack. They started a winter coat drive, a food pantry, and a free tune-up day once a month where they would fix cars for single parents and elderly residents so they could get to work and doctor's appointments. They never sought recognition. Their reward was the quiet knowledge that they were reinforcing the foundations of their community, making it a place where a man like Frank and a boy like Leo would never be left to face the cold alone again. The legacy of that winter was not just one man's downfall, but the rebuilding of a system, piece by piece, to ensure that justice and compassion were no longer luxuries but fundamental rights. The ripple had become a permanent current of change. Spring arrived, and with it, a gentle, persistent warmth that seemed to promise new beginnings. The last of the snow melted away, revealing the green shoots of crocuses pushing up through the damp earth. In Frank and Leo's apartment, the light streamed through clean, new windows, illuminating a space that felt entirely different. It was warm, it was safe. The sad continent on the ceiling had been painted over, replaced by a smooth, clean white. The only drawing on display now was taped to the door of the new refrigerator. It was Leo's latest masterpiece. In the center stood his dad, not leaning on a cane, but standing straight and tall, a small smile on his face. On one side of him was Forge, and on the other, Shepard and Doc. Surrounding them were other members of the Sentinels, their leather vests adorned with the eagle and gear patch. In the drawing, they weren't on motorcycles or in a courtroom. They were at a barbecue in a park under a bright yellow sun. Everyone was smiling. It was a picture of a family, not one of blood, but one forged in loyalty and courage. Frank was in the kitchen making pancakes. The pain in his leg was still there, a dull, constant companion, but it no longer dominated his life. With the stress of his housing situation gone and the support of his new community, he had started a part-time job consulting at a local auto shop, his old skills proving valuable once more. He felt a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. He watched Leo at the table, carefully coloring in the grass in his drawing. The boy was different now. The haunted, watchful silence had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He laughed more. He was thriving. A low rumble started in the distance, growing steadily closer. It was a familiar sound now, not one that caused alarm, but comfort. A single motorcycle pulled up to the curb outside their building. Frank looked out the window and saw Forge, sitting on his bike, just watching the building for a moment. He wasn't there for a reason, not really. He was just checking, making sure the promise was kept. Frank raised a hand in a silent wave. Forge saw him and gave a slow, deliberate nod before turning the handlebars and rumbling off down the street, a guardian continuing his watch. Leo didn't look up from his drawing. He had heard the bike, but the sound was just part of the background of his new life, a reminder that they were not alone. He picked up a blue crayon and carefully drew the sky. The world was bigger and kinder than he had ever known. It was not a perfect world, but it was a world where a drawing could become a shield, where a brotherhood of strangers could become a family, and where a small, quiet boy could find his voice and be heard. The road stretched on for the boy and his father, and for the riders who watched over them, a constant, rolling promise that no one who needed help would ever again be forgotten.